And just like that, can you believe it? You made it. Welcome into the studio. It's Josh Carey here. And this is the series Best Guest Ever. What is that? Well, you know, it's where we bring professional podcast hosts right into our world and have them reveal and identify their absolute favorite episode that they've ever recorded. And furthermore, figure out why. What made that guest in that episode so powerful, so impressive? And then through the episode, we detail some of the great things that the guest did that you can apply to your own guest appearances and speaking engagements. Today, we have an old friend of mine. I say that because we've been connected for a handful of years. It was great to reconnect right before air for a little while. He's also a fellow proud Garden State Jersey guy. It's, of course, Mitch Slater. He's the host of Financially Speaking with Mitch Slater. Welcome to the program.
Oh, pleasure to be here, Josh. Always a pleasure to hang with another Jersey guy and talk podcasts and just love it. Love it. Really happy. What a great idea for the show. Love the idea.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Speaking of good ideas, the episode you identified and came to the table with, it's almost too perfect. You had the great fortune to sit down with your guest, Larry King, the Larry King, who, you know, arguably we know him as the quintessential host of all time, but I'm really excited to really dig into him as a guest. So let's start broadly speaking. How in the world did you meet Larry King? Because I know you have decades old of a history with him to even have had him as a guest. How did all this happen?
I tell you, I was very blessed in my 20s. As my kids said, I really peaked then. But, you know, I was a senior in college. I originally wanted to get into acting. I wound up getting into radio and TV and program director at my station at GW. And I interned actually for Howard Stern. I interned for a number of other people, but I interned, Howard's a whole other episode. But I interned for Charlie Rose, and Larry King was a guest. And at that point, he had a coast to coast radio show. He was the Howard Stern of the day, not the shock jock Howard Stern, but the great interviewer of the day. And I went up to him, did the thing you did. Hi, my name is Mitch Slater, Mr. King. I'm a broadcasting major at GW. I graduated in May. I listen to your show every night, all night. I cannot tell you how much I love you. I would just love to sit down and learn from you. I didn't ask for a job. He said, sure, meet me at Duke Zebert's 1 o'clock. I'm there every day for lunch.
Be there, kid.
Exactly. So sat down with Larry King, which I thought would be an hour, wound up being 4 hours. We talked probably 3.5 hours about baseball and about 30 minutes about the business. And by the end of that lunch, he said to me, there was an opening for an all-night associate producer, and he was going to talk to the woman who's the executive producer. 2 days later, I got the interview. And luckily, a month before graduation, with a box of rejection letters up to here from every radio and TV station in the country, I had a job for $19K as the associate producer of the Larry King Show for Mutual Broadcasting in Arlington, Virginia.
Really?
Lucky me.
Wow. Yeah. So you've been in contact and, you know, connected with him.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that experience, and I've mentioned this so many times in life, is that I learned more, you know, I like to say I learned more from a 3-minute record than I ever learned in school. That's my Bruce Springsteen line. But I learned more from those couple of years working for Larry. And again, to be fair, working for Larry meant getting him his coffee, bringing him his cigarettes. The guests would show up at 10 o'clock. And by the guest, I mean Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Frank Sinatra, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, boyhood heroes. I mean, just incredible opportunities. And then I'd be there all night and tell them who was calling. It's the Portland Laugher. It's the Syracuse Chair. It's Joan from Seattle, whoever. And sometimes at 3 a.m, Larry would actually be falling asleep, which he did a lot. And I would actually go on the air as Larry King from 3 to 4 a.m. And all I would do is, where are you calling from, lady? And let them talk. And then we had carts of Larry's stories. And but, you know, my parents, I would tell them, you know, tonight, listen at 3 a.m. It was
Oh,
incredible. But what I learned so much from that experience, Josh, is two things that have helped me so much in everything I've done in life. Number one, I learned to be an extraordinary listener because he was an extraordinary listener. He told me when I was 21 years old that he never learned anything with his mouth open. You know, he has two ears and one mouth, and that, if you use them, that's the secret of life. And, listening seems to most people a simple and obvious skill, but very, very few people can master it. He mastered it. The other skill that he really mastered was curiosity. And, he always put himself in the position of who's listening to the show because he would have James Michener as a guest and the newest book on space or whatever would be out, and Larry would never read it. Sometimes the authors would be insulted, but Larry's point was the person I'm on the other end, they haven't read it. So, always ask good questions because you don't necessarily know more than your guest, right? And each night I get to watch him asking these questions that the man or the woman on the street were thinking. And that observation just taught me so much about how to be successful in business and honestly, anything that I've ever done. And I've always had this thirst for knowledge and curiosity. So, what I learned in that time period was so important. And, getting to know Larry. And then, of course, we parted ways. I got an opportunity. Actually, he did a TV show that failed that never went on the air before CNN. And the producer of that show hired me to go to California and work on a game show, which is how I moved out to California in 1983. But we stayed in touch. In fact, I was on Love Connection, if you remember that game
of
show.
course,
I was
Chuck
actually a
Willery.
guest. Yeah, well, I went there to apply for a job and I did a video. And 6 months later, I get a call from a young woman named Anita said, "Hey, 56% of the audience thinks we should go out on a date. Watch the show on Thursday. Call me." I watched the show. She was cute. I'm like, sure, why not? And they give you $75 for the date. And we talked, and she was a sports fan. She was a hockey fan. It was hockey season. So I called Larry and I said, "Hey, Larry, can you get me a good seat at the Palm? And I want to, show off here." And he goes, and I'm going to take her to a Kings Ranger game. Anyway, he got me great seats, got me, the table I wanted at the Palm. I mean, just hooked me up right away. And we had Anita and I had a fun 3 or 4 months before I wound up moving back east, and I still have that video, and it's still fun to think about. But so I just kept in touch with him, even though I never got to work with him at CNN. That's a long story. A lot of promises made to me that weren't delivered, but life goes in a lot of different directions. But we stayed in touch. He had his cardiac foundation because GW Hospital saved his life, and he did events in DC. And he always invited me, and I was always there hanging with Don Rickles or Tommy Lasorda, whoever. And then when he moved out to California, and I spent a lot of time there visiting clients and friends, we always got together for bagels or for lunch. And when I started my podcast in 2018, I knew that he was going to be one of my first guests because he was my first guest on my financial radio show in the late 90s on 1050 WEVD, which is now ESPN, in New York. And I had him as a guest then. So, of course, I went out there and we, shot my favorite show. And I think the one that people can learn the most from.
So obviously he kept a sincere relationship with you also, right? There was always this, it seems like mutually beneficial. He seemed to adore you as well.
Yeah, you know what, we had a lot in common. I think our love for sports. When I worked for Larry, I would sit in the box with the Orioles games or the Capitals games or the Redskin games or whoever was playing. And so we always talk sports. And that was always something that we could talk about. And, Larry was the kind of person that he always needed some help. So he would be giving a speech somewhere in New Jersey. He'd call me, go, "Mitch, could you pick me up at the airport?" I mean, I'd worked for him in 20 years. Of course I picked him up. And, he sent me a wedding gift. I mean, little things here and there. We'd stay in touch. Meet him in the city here and there. But towards the end of his life, really the last 15 years, we spent more time together. I got invited into his home a number of times. And the one thing I never got to do was take him to that Bruce Springsteen concert. We came close. He was sick, unfortunately, the last time we had that opportunity in 2016. But, it just, I always kept in touch with him. And in fact, he had a party for 60 years in broadcasting. That was, I think, around 2014, 2015. And I was the only person there from his radio days. And I was just so touched that he had me there. And there were a lot, obviously, celebrities, dignitaries, and everyone that was there. And it was just so nice that he included me in that evening. And I don't know. I mean, I know that I respected him. I wasn't looking to get anything out of him other than, maybe that CNN job back in the mid 90s. But I just loved being with him. I just always learned something. I mean, the guy interviewed every famous person from around the world for 60 years. You name it, he interviewed them.
With that,
popes, presidents, everything.
Yeah, of course. With that significance, does that automatically transfer those skills and talents to the guest seat?
I wondered about that because I had no idea what to expect. When I interviewed him on the radio show, it was a phone call and it was just a couple of questions. It wasn't a big deal. And I was really curious. And I knew within the first 5 minutes of that interview that it would, because he said to me, because there were a couple of things I wanted to ask and I wasn't sure. And he goes, Mitch, my show was called The Larry King Show, Larry King Live. Your show is Financially Speaking with Mitch Slater. You're the host. You get to choose, not me. You can ask whatever you want. I get the choice of answering or not answering, but you're the host. And he made me feel so at ease. He said, if you're honest with your audience, you will never go wrong and you'll never be nervous again. In fact, if you are nervous, tell the person you're nervous. And he told me a story in the first few minutes of that episode. If you got a minute, I'll make it real quick. But when Larry started in radio I guess in the late 50s, early 60s, he was told to go down to Miami Beach. There was a lot of opportunity in radio. And he gets a job at a radio station. And he finally, after a few months, going to have his first show, which is going to be, every day was going to be on. I think it was at 6 o'clock at night to midnight or something like that. And he's about ready to go on the air. And his general manager says, you ready? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, your name's Larry Zeiger. It's a little ethnic. I think we need to come up with a name. And Larry's like, well, it's my name. And the guy literally had the Miami Herald open and there was a big ad for King's Liquors. And he goes, you're now Larry King. 2 minutes later, Larry goes into the studio. It's there, the microphone ready to put on, I think it was a Harry Belafonte song, if I recall. And he's supposed to announce who he is. And the music ends and the microphone goes on, the green light's on, and nothing comes out of his mouth. He couldn't get a word out. He
froze. Wow.
So he puts the music back on. The general manager comes in, screams at him. He goes, God damn it, this is a communication business. Communicate. And Larry puts the microphone on and he goes, folks, my name is Larry King. I literally got that name 5 minutes ago. This is my first big radio job. I am nervous as heck, but I'm going to do my best. And if you stay with me, I hope I can bring you some entertainment. And he was never nervous again in his life. A little bit the first time Sinatra, he told me, but other than that, was never nervous. And, what a great lesson, that came from that. That you just believe in yourself. It also, you can talk about, how failures lead you to success, which we talked about in the interview. But here he was, and he couldn't get it out. And he just somehow found it in him, found that little kid that used to hang out outside Ebbets Field in Brooklyn and call the games because he couldn't afford to get in. His parents were on welfare. I think the state of New York bought him his first pair of glasses. And he would call the games with his friends while watching through a little peephole on Ebbets Field, when Jackie Robinson was playing or whatever. And then he would talk to the players when they would come out and say, why did you bunt in the third inning or whatever? So he remembered that kid inside of him came out that day, and he was never nervous again.
There's something so incredible about that we can all take to heart, is that even somebody like Larry King, at some point in his life, it was all new to him. And that's what I think so many people freeze themselves, because they think, well, wait a minute, I can't achieve this or I can't claim to know that because I don't. Well, you at every stepping stone, at every milestone level of success. And what I'm hearing is Larry said it's okay to admit that you're nervous, and that in and of itself can help the hurdle.
Makes a huge difference. And, one of the other things he said, which ties into that, is he said, you never, ever give up. He goes, if someone can talk you out of it by saying you got no chance, face it, you got no chance. Keep plugging away. His whole point there was like, stop listening to the noise. Don't listen to what people are going to tell you. And trust me, throughout my career as a financial advisor and any broadcasting that I've done, all I've heard over and over, Mitch, that's the craziest idea. Mitch, what are you doing? It took me 6 years to get a podcast at my company because they thought I was absolutely nuts. Now I'm coaching people, 40 other advisors to do podcasts. So, you have to not give up and you can't listen to the noise. And Larry, he's a great, great example of that. And I think that, like I said, sometimes you learn the most from the failure that you may have. And you got to learn from these lessons. And Larry brought a lot in that interview. And that's why I chose that interview because, I hadn't listened to it in a while till we talked. And I was like, my God, there's just so much here. I mean, like I asked him the question about retirement and he said, what would I retire to if you love what you do? I thought, my God, and then that fits me too. I'm a lot younger than he is, but many people at my age, if they retire as a financial advisor, they go to pickleball and play Florida. Maybe not this week, but they that's what they do. I wanted a third career, which is kind of what I'm doing. So, you just got to love what you do. And I think, and Larry also talked about his background story, but he talked about it with such passion and the emotions, and that comes through. And for any podcaster out there, you need to bring that out in your guest, right? We all know that in the first 2 minutes, people are going to decide, I'm moving on. And if you bring out that emotion, and whether you're it doesn't matter whether you're interviewing a Larry King or you're interviewing, a Larry Johnson who just walked by on the street, but was riding his bicycle in an interesting way, or whatever it is,
That's right.
something that's just different.
So Larry is what I'm hearing strategically. You have to tell stories. It's a master storyteller, which, by the way, is a learned skill, right? Whether, I can't tell, I don't know. First of all, you have stories, right? Your life is full of them. Even the things that you think are mundane, figure it out. There's a story within it based on who you are, what you represent, and why you represent it. There's always a story attached. Even finding a quarter on the street could be a story related to who you are, why you are, and how you do it that your audience should hear. He's also very giving. It seems like he's generous. Go on.
No, I was going to cheat for a minute. This is from another episode,
Please.
But it's such a good line that I can't not mention it. I was fortunate to interview Guy Raz, who hosts How I Built This, 110 million downloads, an NPR show. Honestly, great podcaster, great guy. He wrote a book with the same topic. And I had him on my show. We wound up doing an event with him as well. Anyway, Guy said to me, because I asked him, I go, 110 million, man. Like, how does the brain like deal with that? He goes, didn't start that way. He goes, Mitch, he says, if there's 100 people, let's say, listening right now, fortunately there were more, but he said 100 people listening right now, where are you going to go out on the street and stand on your little box and get 100 people to gather around to give a crap about what you have to say?
Even 100.
And I just thought, God, yeah, I mean, and that was the whole point, So it's getting the stories out, and that's what makes him that's what makes any type of medium, whether it's television, film, radio, podcasting, even the little stuff, the TikToks, the reels. If you're not telling a story, there's no excitement. For those not watching, I'm wearing a Met hat for two reasons. One, I'm an enormous Met fan. They won a big game last night. But one of the exciting things for the Mets is that there's always a story. Like, this was a season that was going absolutely nowhere. And then they had this incredible team meeting, and they just changed things. And Grimace, the McDonald's guy, came in and threw out the first pitch, and they're the best team in baseball since then. So there's just these little stories that go around with it. And my mom was also an enormous Met fan, and I lost her last year. And to have this happen now is just so special for me and my family and that story. So life is storytelling, right? You
Mm.
know that, Josh. I mean, and I think anyone that's really has a heartbeat has a story.
I like the idea of finding this episode. You said that, Guy Raz was also another great episode. Another colleague of ours who's on this series as well. She messaged me the other day and said, I'm having a hell of a time identifying my favorite episode. She said, if you asked me for my worst guest ever, oh, I've got plenty to choose from. But the best guest ever, she was finding some difficulty in. Do you have any relation to that where like the talent of guests fluctuate?
Oh, absolutely. And you when you have Larry King as your, top first five guests, it's going to be a little difficult to challenge from that. But yeah, when I first heard about what you were doing, and I was sitting down there thinking, okay, what were my best shows? And I've had people tell me different ones, but I think it's very, very difficult because honestly, everyone that if it made it on my show, they were a great guest. There were maybe three that didn't, and they were just boring, and it just didn't work. But in general, they had a story to tell. I asked the right questions, and I'm gonna have to give a shout out to John Taffer because this guy would host Bar Rescue. He actually went to summer camp with my brother, so there was a connection there, some that helped me get that
You
interview.
know
But
everyone.
it's just, these things happen. You go in the right direction. I don't know. I'm blessed with this stuff. So, John, this is the middle of COVID. He wrote this book called No Excuses, and it was all about how people stop making excuses that, I don't want to hear about this. And, for those who know his show, he goes on and fixes up the bars, and he yells and he screams, and he's, sort of, doing the thing that he's known for. And I had him on the air, and he was sitting at a bar, and we actually used the video because he's pounding his fist about what was happening with COVID. He goes, I don't want to hear these excuses. Let me tell you what this place is doing. Let me tell you what this place is doing. You can be creative. And it was a moment. And a good friend of mine who is fairly critical of many of my episodes, but really likes some others. I respect what he thinks because he's in the radio business. He said that was one of the best moments I've ever heard on a podcast. So, these things happen. And if you ask the right question, you find the right people, and I do my best in every episode to try to bring something out that's memorable because we know this at the end of the day, and it took me a while with podcasting. I learned a lot from your coaching is repurposing and taking these little clips, starting the show with the clip that was so amazing, which I did with John Taffer, and repurposing it. My friend Emily Binder calls it buffalo marketing because the Native Americans used to kill a buffalo and they'd freeze it for the winter and they'd chop it up in little pieces and they'd always be able to grab a piece here and a piece there. And that's what it is. It's finding these pieces that are really, really strong and being able to use them in different situations that may not just be to promote your show, but maybe something that can help somebody else in some other way.
Mitch, the irony of this whole show, Best Guest Ever, having you identify your favorite guest, which you did, and outlining some of the incredibly obvious things or not that Larry did, it's also positioning you as the guest on this show. And certainly you have become the best guest ever for this episode for so many reasons that I want to highlight. Obviously, you're a fantastic guest. You did so many things so well that I want to highlight. You've come prepared. That has to be part of it, right? Showing up to an interview prepared.
Absolutely. That's the only way I know how to do anything except taking my SATs. But other than that, I'm 63 and it still bothers me that I had the lowest math score in the state of New Jersey, but I won't get into that today. But anyway, I always believe in being prepared. And I just think how do you not do that? You asked me to do something today. You're the host. I am grateful for that. What am I going to just show up out of nowhere and not be prepared? Of course I should be prepared. And I think people, some of the best guests that your people will be talking about on your show, it'll turn out they were really prepared, or they're like a Larry King, who's, at the time was 85. He lived to 87, and
Right.
he's sitting there on literally laying on his couch. And I'm sitting on a chair, and we filmed it. You can find it on my YouTube page, and he was just casually telling his stories, which he, did for a living, and still at that point was doing shows. He was still doing 3 shows a week for Aura TV, I think, and he was still interviewing top people. In fact, I was able to bring him, Gary Vaynerchuk, who we both know, as a guest, because I thought it would be such a creative thing to have Gary teach Larry about social media. Larry said to me, "Who's this guy? Vayner? What are you doing?" I said, and I was talking to his producers, and his producers were like, Larry, you got to understand, this is like the king of the millennials right now. This guy is like on fire. Look what he's accomplished. And he's sitting there and he's explaining Snapchat. He's explaining all these things. And Larry absolutely loved it. He had such a curiosity. That's the other word too. He had just such a curiosity for learning. And I think that a good podcaster and the best show that they're going to have will be when they're curious about it. It's why I listen to history podcasts. I love history. I know a lot. It's one of my favorite topics, but I was listening to one on John Dillinger before. I mean, and I learned 1 or 2 things that I didn't know. And it's just, I love that we live in an age that this exists,
True.
man. I mean,
It's
this is
true.
so great. I mean, like everyone else, I had the transistor radio and I was reading comics in bed and whatever, but I as a kid, but the idea that you can get all this knowledge, killer, amazing.
Yeah, I also just want to say real quick that the technical aspect is really important that some people miss. Meaning, you have a mic, you have the right mic, you have lighting, you have the right lighting. You're framed legitimately well. I mean, deliberately. You didn't just show up. You don't and we've all seen worse, and that matters. That plays a part. The technical aspect of it.
Yeah, for those that can't see, I have something that's I cherish very much. It was an event for Larry, and I bid on it. And Peter Max did this beautiful lithograph, one of the greats of all time. It's signed by Larry. It's signed by Peter Max. I don't know what it's worth, a lot of money, but it's worth more to me than whatever the dollar amount is. So I knew that would be important for me to just have this. When Larry passed away a couple of years ago. He died from COVID, unfortunately. And I did one of the last interviews with him. I also did a podcast, which I was never able to air because it got political. And my company was not into it. But Larry finally came clean on how he felt, let's just say, about one particular politician. And it wound up being used in a lot of TV interviews after he passed away. And I wound up putting together my own production, hired a production company to help me. And it was just sort of interviews that I had with Larry. Larry was on 60 Minutes, by the way, when I was working for him in 1982, and John Dean was the guest. And we found the footage, and you see the 23-year-old guy who had a full head of hair back then, and walking John Dean to his chair, and then going and sitting at my station, picking up the phone and pressing the buttons. And I had forgotten that existed. I found it on YouTube, of course, and the fact that that these things exist and these memories exist, and you can talk to people about it. It's amazing. And I didn't know Larry was going to pass so soon after our interview. But one of the things he talked about, which I just kind of want to mention because I thought it was really, really just so special, is that he talked about not being around. He goes, I can't understand death. Like it just doesn't make any sense to me. He says, like, you're here, you're not here. And what he said to me was, and it hit me so much when he passed away, he goes, I'm so afraid to not exist. He says, I'm not a religious guy. I grew up Jewish in Brooklyn, but I just don't believe in afterlife God. It's just not who I am. But what I struggle with is that, there's the was and there's not was. And then we were talking about, and he says, now that I think about it, you don't exist before you were born. So it's really no different. You didn't exist then, you're not going to exist again. And somehow we found that peace. But I said, what are you going to miss the most, Larry? And he goes, you know what? Not knowing the scores from last night. Like, will the Dodgers win the World Series? Which, he's a big Dodger fan. I'm a Met fan, but we still got along. Is Tiger Woods going to make a comeback? Little things he talked to me about in that episode. And, sadly, he, didn't find those things out. And that's the other thing, when you have an opportunity in your life with someone who's much older, to talk to them. And I'm just going to throw this in real quickly because my other favorite guest was my mom, who at age 90, just through connections of mine and just pure luck, introduced the concert for Steve Van Zandt, who I know danced on stage with Steven and his band, and a guy named Bruce Springsteen came and walked her off the stage, sat with her, took one of the great photos of all time. And then Bruce went out and played. And then because of all this, I got a call from a casting agency for J-Date, the Jewish dating service, that they were looking for old Jewish women, yentas, to be put in a print ad where they would be coding, to find the perfect match for their grandson or their granddaughter. And my mom's photo, 6 months later, she got the audition, by the way, and won it. It was like a Woody Allen movie. It was hysterical. $2,500, lead yenta. And her ad was all over the New York, New Jersey area, top of Junior's Cheesecake, charging stations, subway stations, and these amazing, amazing experiences. And I interviewed her when she was 94. I lost her last December at 96. And I'm so glad that I did that. And that if I could leave your audience with one thing, for those special people in your life, you're so lucky to have the technology we have today. Interview those people so your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, or somebody else at least can learn a little bit more about these people that were so special to you.
My goodness, Mitch, thank you for all that. This episode certainly is just about life affirming. That's what it's about. That's the theme I'm getting. Like celebrating Larry's life, celebrating your mom's life, and celebrating each of our lives while we're still here. My goodness, thank you, Mitch. This has been incredibly powerful and impactful.
Well, and thank you for asking, Josh. And again, I've learned so much from you and everything that you do in this business. And it's really great to have people out there like you that are creative, coming up with these ideas. And I love creativity, and I'm honored that I got the chance to speak about Larry. Certainly, that's always a great pleasure for me.
Well, you're awesome. Thanks so much, Mitch.
Thank you.